Hi everyone, this is USCF expert Garpgrana. In this video, I'm going to be giving a rundown of my favorite opening, the Italian game. The Italian game is my favorite opening for a couple of reasons. One, I played it when I just got into chess. So back around COVID, 2020, 2021, I really got into chess just by playing this opening quite a bit. And you might wonder why I chose this opening. The reason I chose this opening was because I wanted a system that would be relatively solid and relatively simple to play while having dynamics that I could outplay my opponents in if I was the better player. For a few openings, like, say, the Roy Lopez, it's not always about being able to capitalize on an opportunity later in the game. A lot of the time, you get some sharp positions where, for example, even here, black can try and play things like b5, bishop b7, and this is kind of an archangel way of playing. That's kind of what the opening is called. So these systems often end up being quite sharp, and for a starting out player, typically what you want to do is not get into these skirmishes where the positions are difficult to understand and you don't really have much control. What you want to do is learn how to kind of get control of the positions that you arise in your games. So that's why I picked the Italian opening, which is the opening that arises after the moves 1 e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. And I think this Italian opening is a really strong weapon, and it seems that in recent years, top grandmasters have been taking a liking to the opening. Magnus Carlsen, Anish Giri, Hans Niemann especially, I believe in older, but Vichy used to play quite a bit. All these grandmasters have really incorporated the opening into their repertoire, and for good reason. I think especially for players like Hans, Magnus, Fabi, they often just want to get a game where they can try to outplay their opponent. And the Italian opening, in my opinion, is one of the best ways that you can do that. If you can play it right, and there's not necessarily a specific way of playing it that you have to say is the correct way of playing it. I think there's quite a few sub-variations within the Italian opening that are quite viable, but if you understand the ideas well, you can really squeeze your opponents in a way where they often won't know what hit them, and it takes quite a bit of deep analysis to review and understand what mistakes they made. But if you have internalized the ideas of the opening well, then the analysis will actually come quite naturally to you, because it's just going to be an avenue of calculation that you have to do based on the ideas that you have, and it's actually not going to be that difficult of a process, provided that you're learning the ideas well. So within the Italian opening, there are a few possible systems that can arise, and both kind of depend on the way that black and white play. So, one, black can play the move bishop to c5, or they can play the move knight to f6, or they can play the move bishop to e7. These are typically the main ways of playing the Italian. As you can see, these are kind of the engine-preferred ways, and there are some transpositions where d6 and bishop e7 are likely going to lead to the same positions. There even is a way of playing the opening with g6 and bishop to g7, although it's typically a different move order. They typically play it a couple moves later to get the best version of it as black. But these are the main systems that you'll encounter, and they all have slightly different nuances, but I think that you can play them in a pretty similar way. So in this video, I'm going to really try to emphasize the ways that you can play it at each and every level, where I think the ideas are actually relatively universal. So in the Italian, the most important thing is that you understand the ideas well. The specific lines are actually not as important. That's also one of the reasons that I chose the Italian as my main opening, because it didn't require heavy theoretical, sharp preparation. Where maybe some of you like that, in which case that's perfectly fine. And that doesn't mean the Italian opening isn't for you, because I play sharp openings quite a bit myself still. I played the Nimzo Indian. I've tried to play the Benoni quite a bit. I play the Catalan. I guess the Catalan's a little bit more positional, but you kind of get the point where just because an opening isn't sharp doesn't mean that you can't outplay your opponent in it. In fact, I think that in many cases, it's better breeding grounds to have complex dynamics, because you're not forcing the issue, where if your opponent just understands the lines in the opening, they could just equalize. The Italian opening is the opposite of that, where as long as you can get a game with some deep preparation, rather with a deep understanding of the ideas, you can outplay your opponent. And that's really what teaches you good chess habits. Understanding how you can outplay your opponent from an equal position by better understanding the positions. Okay, so let's talk about some of these sub-variations. And by the way, in this video, I'm going to be going over a few games that I've played over the board, as well as one Grandmaster game that actually occurred, I believe, yesterday. So hopefully you'll find these games instructive, and I think don't focus too much on the specific variations, but rather the ideas within the opening and the themes that you can try to naturally incorporate, because when you start playing it and you understand what moments the ideas you should be incorporated and what moments there are some nuances, that's the best way to kind of get your own chess to another level and better understand the ideas yourself. The best way to get better at chess is by playing chess. So these tips aren't going to get you all the way in terms of being an expert at the Italian without some practice. And I think that's your case with most chess openings that you play. Okay, so let's go over some typical ideas in the Italian. One common theme, and I say theme because technically it's a trap, but it's a trap that kind of underlies the opening structure a little bit that you should try to be familiar with. So one theme that you'll often see is that after a move like bishop c5, d3, d6, a4, say knight f6, c3, black is actually obliged to push this a pawn. Take a moment to maybe understand why if you haven't seen this before, but this is actually called Noah's Ark trap, where it seems like black is doing completely fine and they can just play whatever they want because it doesn't seem like white has a threat. But actually, there is a 2-move deep threat rather than a 1-move threat. So if black just castles, white has this move b4, bishop to b6, and a5, which trap the bishop on b6. So that is why in these positions, black is typically going to play either the move a5 or a6 to give the bishop a square on a7. I think you see the moves a6 and a5 kind of with relatively similar frequency. Personally, I prefer the move a5. I'm not an e5 player anymore. I used to be an e5 player about maybe 8 months ago, up until 8 months ago. And when I played the Italian as black, I would always play the move a5 because I like that it took some space. Even though it does weaken the b5 square, I think that taking some space on the queen side prevents some of the deeper ideas that white can have in the Italian, but it's still very difficult to deal with if white knows what to do and has a deep understanding of the opening. Okay, so that is one theme in the opening, and the reason that I call it a theme is because this is a tempo-winning move. This is a tempo-winning setup. By playing a4 and c3, you force black to commit this pawn move, which in many cases they don't really want to do because they'd rather just develop their bishop, like say they'd like to play bishop to g4 or they'd like to play bishop to e6 or bishop e7, but all of these moves simply allow the bishop to get trapped. and therefore they can't get a development advantage, while white, by playing this move c3, gets a potential space advantage in the center because they can make the move d4 at some point. Okay, so let's move on from that, but just an important idea to kind of keep in mind. Okay, second, one thing to kind of note in the Italian game is that you would often have this idea of playing knight to g5, or rather, it's one specific way that you can play the Italian. The reason that this is kind of not as popular among most top players is because there's a concrete refutation, not refutation, but concrete way of playing that kind of makes the game a little bit dynamically equal with d5. So this is kind of the Poliero setup, and you often get positions like this where black has sacrificed a pawn, but they have a couple pieces developed, and this knight is kind of a little bit misplaced. This bishop on d3 prevents white's development a little bit, and if black knows what to do, then they can get some initiative for the pawn, and in many cases it fizzles out to be a draw in the main lines. So that's why white doesn't typically go for the immediate knight g5, and if black develops, if black has time to develop, say bishop to c5, now if you play knight g5, then simply castling is just bad for white because white does not have an actual threat. They can take on f7, but they give up 2 pieces in the process, and 2 pieces in a middle game for a rook, even if you get a pawn, is not a good trade. Okay, so what you'll typically get in these positions is after a move like castles, d6. So here I'm going to be going over the bishop c5 structures, the bishop c5 positions, and then the bishop e7 positions are a little bit separate, but a lot of the ideas do carry over. So I think it's important to just focus on if you get a position like this, a classic one where you have bishop c4 and bishop c5 included. As long as you understand the main ideas in this position, you should be able to even wing the positions with bishop e7 a little bit. Okay, so personally, what I like to do is play this move a4 once black has committed to the move d6, because at the moment, if you think about it, black might want to try and get our bishop on c4 by playing the move knight to a5. However, if they try to do it immediately, we can simply take the pawn on e5. And even if they get the bishop pair, it's not a particularly good position. Just taking with the knight, and this position, even if you get the bishop pair, it's not compensation for a pawn without some development advantage. So typically, black will try to defend the pawn with d6 as kind of a mirror setup of white, and at this moment I like to play a4 because we again kind of get our attempted setup with a4 and c3, while preventing the move knight a5 from being as effective because we can simply play the move bishop to a2, and black's knight is a little bit misplaced here, so typically black will not play like this. Okay, now if black tries to play a move like bishop to g4, which is often, I think, what especially like lower level players or beginners are kind of scared of, where this knight is going to get pinned and things like knight d4 might happen, and it looks kind of scary, like, oh, this black bishop is like controlling this diagonal and creating some threats against our king as well. Our king's about to get opened up. It's very easy to panic and think that this is a good way of playing for black, but actually, in my experience, it's actually not that good of a way of playing, because objectively, after the move like c3, black has some troubles in the center. Why is that? So black will likely play a move like a5 now, because we have the c3 and a4 setup, And we can even play a move like bishop to e3, and this is the system that I generally recommend, not necessarily with the bishop on g4. With the bishop on g4, it's better to be a little bit more concrete, where you play this move h3, bishop h5, and knight bd2. And what happens is that actually, even though it seems like this bishop is accomplishing a goal of trying to put pressure on the king side, what ends up happening is that it becomes a target for the regular Roy Lopez maneuver, which is also an Italian maneuver, of rook to e1, knight to f1, and knight to g3. And once you get these knights to f3 and g3, this bishop ends up having to go to g6, and doesn't have great scope. It just sees this diagonal where it's hitting a pawn, and white kind of has a free roll at the center where they can play moves like bishop b3 and d4 at any moment to put severe pressure on the center for black. So for that reason, black can actually be under a little bit of stress when they play like this. So after something like h6, rook e1, castles, knight to f1, bishop to g6 is even a better move to play prophylactically than just allowing knight g3. But even if they play something like rook to e8, knight to g3, bishop to g6, and I think bishop to e3 is a very viable way of playing. Here you can try to play for d4, so like f takes and then d4, which is also a theme in a lot of positions. I think it's probably one of, it's like maybe the second most important theme after the c3 a4 ideas, other than also maybe queen b3. So queen b3 and playing for d4 are kind of the two main themes that you'll see in the Italian opening, because you put some pressure on f7 and the pawn on b7. Now in this case, there's not as much pressure on f7 because this bishop is protecting the pawn, but it's still a little bit of an issue to deal with because white just takes control of this entire diagonal and already has easy play in the center. Because this pawn is also weak, black has to deal with that immediately, and it's just a little bit of a nuisance to deal with. The best move for black here is knight e7, just giving up this pawn. Now, it's not quite giving up the pawn, I think, because there's this move bishop to b6, and this queen is actually going to be a little bit stuck. So a move like rook to a7 is actually threatening to trap the queen. So it's not actually a pawn that can be taken at the moment, but it's just always going to be a little bit under pressure, which is why this position's kind of just going to be unpleasant for black. So after a move like bishop to e3, bishop takes e3, pawn takes e3, or okay, rook takes e3 is also playable. Actually, I think rook takes e3 is maybe a little bit better in this specific situation, just because f takes allows kind of play with c65, whereas playing for rook takes e3, and if they play c6 now, allows d4, and you keep this pawn on e4 protected. However, don't be scared to play a move like f takes e3, even though in principle you often don't want to kind of double your pawns. It's actually a relatively decent structure, and it's the structure that I actually am advocating for in the main lines. So this is kind of the way that you should play the Italian. If black wants to try and play for bishop g4, you end up just getting a nice kind of clamp in the center where you can put some positional pressure. Okay, but what if they don't play bishop to g4? In that case, often what will happen is you'll get something like castles, and now you can decide whether or not you want to include h3, and often they will respond with a move like h6 as well. But first, I like to include c3 because this move bishop to g4 is just kind of objectively not a great move. So giving black the opportunity to still play it on this move is not a bad idea. And also here, b4 is still a threat, so black really should respond with the pawn move on the a file. And again, I like to often play h3 in these situations, just because now you can either play bishop to e3 or h3, and it doesn't matter. Um, but with bishop to e3, bishop takes e3, pawn takes e3. In this specific situation, you do allow sometimes knight e7, where after knight to d2, they can try to play for c6 and d5 a little bit more easily than they typically get. So if you play d4 here, then d5, and bishop to d3, and they kind of get a reasonable version of the main lines. But this is honestly fine as well. But the reason that I like to play h3 is just because it does shut down some knight b4 ideas in many cases, and black will often respond with h6, and you kind of get some closure on the king side, so that now you can try to play in the center more concretely. Once the king side is closed, because the center play is now the main focus of the position, because black is a little bit, or rather because white is a little bit ahead in their central control, they can try to push further than black can. So after these two moves, and typically h6 ends up getting included so that knight g5 doesn't end up being a problem in the future, where queen b3 and knight g5 can put some severe pressure on the diagonal. Technically, you don't have to play it. You can play a move like bishop to e6, but really, it's often going to be a good idea for black to commit to h6 earlier, so that they don't run into issues with queen b3 and knight to g5 potentially. So something like queen d7 is fine here, bishop b3, and just because knight g5 is always present at a moment's notice, it can be a bit of a nuisance to deal with for black. As you can see, h6 is the suggested line of the computer, though they can also play b6, knight bd2, and white kind of just waits and sees if black is going to make this e6 weakness more vulnerable than it is at the moment, and strike when that happens. Otherwise, white can simply maintain the position and it's relatively equal, but black has to be accurate, whereas white kind of gets the free roll. After something like rook f7, they also do allow knight g5 and rook e7, and you can see this kind of situation is a little bit passive, where you can even probably play a move d4 for white, and there's concretely d5, but in any case, you get a pretty reasonable position. And I guess after pawn takes, e takes, this is a bit of, it's not quite the desired structure, because typically you'd like to play a move like e4 here, but because your knight is not on f3, just the d4 pawn is hanging, so it's not really the way to play. But in this situation, you can play something like rook a2 e1 is good, and I think queen to b5 is also quite reasonable, because if they take now, you can simply take back, and the pawns here all defend each other and create kind of a nice triangle structure. That's also one theme I'd like you to keep in mind as well, that the pawn structure with the pawns on b2, c3, and d4 is actually a very, very robust one. And because it's so robust, white often has very decent control of the square on e5, even if in this case it is being occupied by a pawn. White often puts pressure on the center by those means, because this pawn is so well protected, and black doesn't really have a means of actually taking the structure down. They can maybe try to play for something like e5, but because it's such a solid structure, they have to be a little bit patient in the way that they break it down. So that's also why black will typically play the move h6 immediately after white plays h3. It's not really something you should be so worried about if they don't play h6. It's a relatively solid move for both sides in any case. And the main thing here is that, sorry, not after, so at this point. So typically you'll get a position like this, and then you can play something like bishop to e3. And this is the line that I advocate for. And you might see the engine say, oh, it's minus 0.08, it's not a good position, it's objectively slightly inaccurate. But this is a system that most people probably are not as well versed in as they are in the main lines, where white often will play bishop to b5 and try to damage the structure, and then maybe play bishop to e3, or try to play for d4, try to play rook e1, and then play bishop e3 and capture with the rook. Those are typically the positions that people are more well versed in. But this is kind of a concrete way of playing where bishop to e3 is arguing, hey, if you take my bishop on e3, then I'm going to be playing for the center by playing knight to d2 and d4, and simply saying, hey, how are you going to deal with my central space? Objectively, the engine considers this to be a decent position for black, but I actually think that in practice, it's a very decent position for white regardless. So after the move knight e7, which prepares this idea of c6 and d5 to try and strike back at the center, by way of having maybe a more solid pawn structure as black, you can play the move queen to e1, and after c6, knight bd2, and knight g6, with these moves h3 and h6 included, as white, you get to play the move queen to g3, and notice that you are threatening this knight on g6 because this bishop on c4 is pinning the pawn to the king. So black typically should play something like king to h7, and you can play the move pawn to d4, and you simply get the center. And yes, black can try to play for some flank attacks and for some counter chances in the center, but the fact that it's so solid means that black is going to be constrained for a large portion of the game to dealing with the lack of central space, and it can just be a little bit unpleasant to maneuver in these situations. Just to imagine that you're playing as black in this situation, how are you going to proceed? Let's say, so here it's white's move. Let's say something like rook to c1 or rook to d1. I think it's a little bit hard to tell from this perspective what the best move is. I think maybe bishop to d3 is pretty reasonable. But yeah, bishop to d3 I think is pretty reasonable, because now if you play something like pawn to d5, then you can kind of see white can simply capture, and you're opening everything up against the king. And there's immediate threats of things like knight h4. So if you capture back, also you have the move knight takes e5. So it's kind of hard to actually combat the center. And okay, you can play the move pawn to b5, but white can hold everything with pawn to b3, and it's just a relatively equal position where you can still try to outplay your opponent. Ultimately, chess is not going to be a win for either side after just a few minutes of the opening, so what you can try and do is grind down your opponent in a position where they simply feel uncomfortable. And here, it's again not easy to see what you should play. If you play move by bishop to e6, a lot of the time you're allowing things like pawn to d5. In this case, not quite, but just as white, you can kind of see it feels a little bit unpleasant because you're just getting attacked on, as black, you're simply getting attacked on the king side, and it's just a little bit unpleasant. So white can play slow moves like bishop to c2, and black doesn't really have a plan to concretely break down the center. They can maybe try to play slow improving moves like rook to e8, but black is kind of struggling to really make use of their own play. And okay, rook e1 is concretely slightly inaccurate because you do allow b takes a4, b takes a4, and rook to b2, and you have to deal with some activity. But as white, you don't even have to allow the rook to get in. You can simply play a takes, c takes, and okay, now maybe black can try and create some passer on the queenside, but they always have to deal with this kingside attack, and by playing like this, they also allow them d5 in many cases, and they allow additional pressure on e5. So it's not an easy position to handle regardless. So pawn to c4 is actually quite an unpleasant move for black to deal with, because after takes, b takes, you're again threatening to just take some space in the center, and black is really just constrained. So even though the engine kind of gives this way of playing a minus 0.05 evaluation, in the long run, the central space that white has really puts black under some positional pressure. And you can play other lines as well, but I think this line is a very, very good tool as a beginner, because you kind of know the moves that you want to play, you know the ideas that you want to play, and your opponent has to deal with a position that just has positional problems. And if they don't understand concretely what to do, then they're gonna kind of get suffocated. And what this opening also teaches you to do is learn where you will get some positional opportunities, when you'll get positional opportunities, because in a slow game, you have to learn to evaluate the smaller details more finely. And that's a skill that once you build as a beginner, you kind of carry with you as you progress in the rating ladder, and it kind of allows you to become a more precise player by capitalizing on the small advantages that you might get. Okay, so hopefully that was a good rundown of the bishop to c5 variations, and we'll also take a look at the bishop to e7 variations, but just to not overload you as a viewer with kind of too many things to remember. I'm gonna just mention a couple of details, and then we'll move on to looking at the games in store. So in the bishop to e7 lines, you can play typically moves like a4 and c3 as well, and what will generally happen is you will try to play for things like h3 and castling, and just preventing black from getting any active play. So the point of playing h3 again is preventing both the knight and the bishop from accessing squares on the queen side. So after something like, say, castles h3, black typically will have to play bishop to e6 to try and get their bishop out, but now you simply take, and play something like a5, where you have a nice space advantage, and this bishop on e7 is very passive. So it is fine for black, because they do have some central space to compensate the lack of coordination, but it's also not anything to worry about as white. Okay, so just generally, that means that you can kind of apply the same ideas in these lines as you might in the bishop to c5 lines. There's also one other way of playing these positions where you can try to take immediate control of the center by trying to place a knight on d5. So rather than playing c3, you can also play for something like knight to c3, and if black castles, then you can castle, or you can play bishop to g5. And there are some tactics to be aware of, just that knight takes e4 is an option here. So you can play knight takes e4, and d5 is available. Bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, knight takes e5, and the move that black has to know here, which is not an easy one to know, like most people, I don't think if they're getting into the position kind of will know this line. The best move here is f6. Not capturing either of these pieces, but attacking the third one, and saying that after knight f3, d takes c4, b takes c4. Even though white is up a pawn, this position is supposed to be fine for black, which it's not at all easy to play, regardless of if you know it. So queen takes d1, queen takes rook takes d1, and you kind of just get a bit of an unpleasant situation for black because they're simply down a pawn and they have to find compensation for it. Objectively, it's equal still. Objectively, it's balanced still, but it's not necessarily an easy path for black to go down. So this is a line that's playable, and after something like, say, they can play the move bishop to g4, which is typically the main way of playing, but let's just say they make a nothing move like a5, then you can play h3 and just say, I'm going to clamp down on the king side, and now after something like bishop to e6, you can play bishop takes f6, and knight to d5, where you immediately take control of the d5 square, and you can always capture on f6 and kind of place black in a bit of a positional bind. That is why black will typically take on d5, you take back, and you're kind of threatening positionally to take on c6, which is why black will typically play knight to b4, bishop to c4, bishop to b3, bishop to a2. They're kind of all playable. I think bishop c4 makes a lot of sense. And then d5 takes, and this kind of structure is generally pretty nice for white to play. It's not winning or anything, but white kind of gets some easy pressure on this e-pawn, and black has to kind of find a plan to counteract that. So knight b6, bishop to b3, knight d7, c3, and it's an equal position. So this is one way of playing, and then the other was kind of just playing with the c3, a4 mechanisms. And I guess the one thing to note is that you're not going to quite get the same kinds of positions with the bishop on e7 versus the bishop on c5, because you don't quite get the same tempo winning moves. But what you really want to do is kind of, instead of trying to play for the center as much, you want to play against the passivity of this bishop. So something like castles, say h3, bishop d6, takes, and you just will generally try to play against its passivity after something like a5, and just try to take space rather than in the center. You try to take space on the queen side, and be okay with black recognizing that they played a setup where if they try and take space in center, they're not quite as strong in it because this bishop is not controlling the squares that it would if it was on c5. So something like d5 can be played, knight bd2, and if they try and trade, then you can simply take with the pawn, or you can take with the knight. But taking with the pawn is nice because you don't have to trade queens, and black is left with these double pawns that serve as long-term weaknesses. And if black, say, just plays a6, then you can castle and try to play this maneuver with rook e1, knight f1, knight to d3, and you get a pretty comfortable position. With the rook on e1, you're also threatening to take on d5, take back. If the queen takes back, it's just leaving the pawns kind of doubled, and if the pawn takes back, then you can take on e5. I think sometimes there's some compensation there, but generally it is just a free pawn. So you can kind of imagine something like bishop to c5, rook to e1, h6, then after takes. In this case, this is actually bad because the rook is on an open file, so you do need to be a little bit careful. But you can also just play with knight to f1 and play or okay, here you can't quite do that because this pawn on d5 cannot really be captured, because this pawn on e4 is currently under threat. But what you can do is try to take some space with b4. After bishop a7, you can play something like knight to, no, sorry, not quite here. You can play to b1, knight h5, knight f1, and so once this knight moves, you're okay with playing some knight f1 and then playing bishop d3, something like queen d6, and you can play knight h2 as well, and you have kind of a relatively solid position. This way of playing, I also am not quite a fan of either, because it does allow some activity to black that it's kind of the point of their setup. And that's why I generally like to play for b4 as early as I can, so that this bishop can just never get to c5. You can play d5, you can play knight d2, and this is kind of a better version in my opinion. So hopefully that illustrates why you want to play it in a way where you're taking advantage of the passivity of this bishop and not allowing it to get to this diagonal. Alright, so hopefully that was somewhat instructive, and now let's go ahead and take a look at some games. And this first game, I think, is maybe the most instructive one of the bunch, because it's an over-the-board game that I played at the Pan Am's Collegiate Championship 2 years ago, in 2024, where at the time I was rated 1250 USCF, although I was definitely a little bit underrated. Quite a bit underrated. I think I was at least 1700 strength, because in the previous Pan Ams I was 900 and I had taken down a 1900 as well. So I was definitely a decent bit underrated, and I had drawn a Cannon Master as well in this event. So let's go ahead and take a look at this game. And that's not to say that I had a perfect understanding of the Italian either, but I do think that I played this game quite well. However, there was also a lot to learn from this game, and I think this game is the main motivator for the way that I play the Italian, because it illustrated a very nice point, a nice nuance as to what makes the Italian opening so dangerous, that I didn't quite understand in the game. Okay, so my opponent allowed the Italian. They played knight f6, d3, bishop c5, c3, 4, d6, and a6. Okay, so my opponent goes for this setup where they don't take as much space. You can play for the move b4. I didn't quite go over that, but just thematically, it's also a bit easier to not try and remember all these lines with b4 and the nuances. But at some point, b4 is also just a generally decent idea if they do play a6. You don't have to play it immediately, but it is always in the air, at least, so... but I like to just kind of slow play it, so I played these castles. After bishop a7, bishop to e3, my opponent played castles, and after the game, I learned probably my most important lesson in the Italian, at least as an expert level player, that taking on a7 is actually an extremely uncomfortable move for black. And the reason for that is that black doesn't really want to capture it in either way. If they capture with the knight, then they're taking a piece off the center, which was kind of developed, and they have to spend another move to just get it back developed. And in the meantime, you can just play something like knight bd2, and black has to play the move c5 and allow simple breaks like d4, but also with c5 you can play the move h3, and after something like knight c6 you can still play for d4, but not quite yet, but you can play something like knight f1, and just the d5 square is severely weakened. Additionally, after knight takes, you can play the move rook to e1 and try to play for d4 immediately, and if they play c5 here, now you just get d4 because your knight on b2, your knight on d2, is not blocking the queen, protecting the pawn on d4. So I think the rookie one is definitely the more accurate one, but knight bd2 is also playable. And if rook takes a7, a lot of the time, black will actually end up having some problems with this back rank, where firstly, white can put some pressure on the b pawn still if black ever moves the rook away from a7. So by playing in this fashion, black is always going to be giving white some weaknesses to target if they move the rook back to a8. And they also are wasting a tempo on top of it, which is just a very uncomfortable thing to do. So typically, black will not move the rook back immediately, but in doing so, when you get into the endgame, oftentimes you will get a rook onto the back rank that black has to deal with, and it's just a position where black is typically losing if the rook is on the back rank, because there's just no real counterplay for the activity that white has. But in this game, I didn't know about this nuance. I was definitely still on my way to improving to an expert level player, so I played the move queen c2, which is also a viable move. And I think that if you're a beginner, you shouldn't be so concerned about this nuance. But just as you progress, you might start to understand why bishop takes a7 is objectively quite a strong move. But queen to c2 is absolutely fine as well. So if you're a beginner, don't focus so much on the small nuances, just try to focus on the general way of playing the position. Unless you just like to explore it, but... So bishop takes c3, f takes c3, and that is also why you should take on a7 when you have the opportunity. Typically, when you have the moves h3 and h6 included, so in this game I didn't, but if you have the moves h3 and h6 included, then you actually will have time, say after bishop to e3 castles, you will actually have time to still play knight bd2 first, and I typically like to play it like this, where after bishop takes e3, now that you have the knight on d2, you can play for d4 more easily, and you still have queen b3 ideas, and it's just generally quite reasonable. Whereas without the inclusion of these moves, bishop to e3, say castles, knight bd2, the slight difference, and this is kind of one to be aware of if you're a more advanced player, is that after knight to e7, black is actually quite solid on the king's side still, and they can play for the center. And the reason they're solid is because after knight g6, you don't have this idea of playing queen e1, queen g3 that actually puts pressure on the knight, because the h6 pawn has not committed itself to h6, so it's not a pin. Whereas if you had the moves h3 and h6 included, then after knight d2 takes, knight to e7 is not quite as strong a move, as you can see according to the engine, because firstly you can play for the move d4, but secondly you can always play for queen e1, and you have like stuff like knight h4, where you're just gonna have more weaknesses on the side to attack. So with knight h4, knight to g6 is now not possible, because knight takes g6 is a pin and the h pawn cannot be captured. Whereas in the other position, without h3, h6, after takes, knight e7, knight h4, knight to g6 is still playable and is perfectly fine for black. In this case, maybe it's a little bit unpleasant still, but the fact that they can always move the knight to g6 is why you're fine with playing knight bd2 if knight bd2 without capturing on a7 first, if the h pawn has moved, and if it hasn't moved, then you typically will want to capture first. So that's why I recommend playing the setup with h3 and h6, which I didn't play in this game. So just to be clear here, I would recommend starting with h3 and h6, not as I did in the game, where I didn't have quite as set of an opening repertoire as a kind of younger player. Younger as in younger in the duration of time that I had played chess for, which was just a couple, 1 or 2 years. So here, after bishop to e3, queen c2, is still a solid way of playing. Knight bd2, knight h7, rook to f2, knight to g5. And this maneuver by black was actually kind of a bad one. Take a second to maybe think about why that might be the case. But the main reason that this is not a good maneuver is just because all it's doing is trading off my knight on f3 for their knight on h7, which it's not even clear if my knight on f3 is a particularly superior piece to that knight. So rather, the knight on f6 for my knight on f3. And in doing so, they're also opening up the f-file to actually having potential tactics and real pressure on f7. The knight on f6 actually did a job of blockading the pressure that was being put on f7. So after knight h7, rook to f2, knight takes knight to g5. White can even play knight takes g5, but I think that just playing in the center is a very prudent way of playing, which is not what I did in the game. I played rook af1, which I think is also very strong, because you're simply saying that you're threatening to take on g5 now and actually capture on f7, where, okay, black can take on e3 with check, king h1, but it's just a bad position because of how much pressure the black position is under. So say something like, say a waiting move, then you have knight takes g5, queen takes g5, rook takes f7, queen takes c3, check, king h1, and black kind of has to take, but rook f7, and they're not in a good position because you can take on c7, and okay, I guess you can't quite take on c7 here because there's queen e1 check and checkmate, but black is simply not as active as white is, and after something like queen d1, you are threatening to take on c7, and you can play things like knight to f1, knight to g3, and put some pressure on the g7 pawn. Okay, so that is why my opponent played bishop to e6, trying to counteract the pressure on the diagonal, and I played bishop takes e6. They played, sorry, no, I did not play bishop takes e6. I played d4. And in hindsight, I should have played bishop takes e6, because by playing d4, I do get the center, but what happens is that, and this is also somewhat a common theme, but maybe a more advanced theme, that after bishop takes c4, which is what my opponent played, they could have tried to play for flank space. And that is typically the best way of compensating the center that you get in the Italian as black, because this knight on c4 is actually quite loose. And because it's so loose, a move like b5 is actually relatively strong, because even though I have the center as white, black is starting to actually make some inroads on the queen side by taking their own space. So they can play something like knight takes f3, knight takes f3, and rook to b8, and by playing for something like b4, they attack the base of the pawn structure. And even though, as I said before, this b, c, d, b2, c3, d4 pawn structure is generally quite solid, if black is able to try and play for space on the queen side, they can try to attack the base of the pawn chain, which it typically doesn't happen, but in this case it does happen. So that's why this is kind of not the correct way of playing, where I played d4 immediately, because yes, I got space, but my center is actually not as stable as one might think, because of the fact that my knight allows for some flank attacks. But my opponent did not play in the most accurate way. They played b6, trying to maybe slow play the position, and what happened was that I played the move b4, and this is sometimes a bit of a risky move to play, just because this C pawn can be a little bit overloaded in the defense of the B pawn and the D pawn. So if you imagine something like A5 existing right now, then and say the B pawn was protected by another piece, then after takes, the D pawn would actually not be protected after knight takes f3, rook takes f3, b takes, and there would not be enough defenders. But in this case, there's not really a concrete issue, because if they take on d4, then you just take back, and you have the center. They can't really overload the weaknesses. Play a5, just play b5. So the center is intact, and if you can play for space in this kind of way, then often it is a good idea. I think it was a good idea in this game. So my opponent played the move queen to e7, trying to put some pressure on this e pawn indirectly by threatening takes, e takes d4, e takes d4, and then taking on e4. But what I can do is I can take on g5 first, which is what I played, so that now this pressure is kind of relinquished. And after queen takes g5, I play the move rook to f3. For one, trying to take control of the f and g files, but for another, making sure that my e pawn is defended, so that if on something like b5, trying to remove the defender, my rook is still defending the e pawn. Okay, so my opponent played queen e7, and I played the move d5, and my opponent probably should not have allowed me to get this kind of structure, but I guess technically more accurate would have maybe been to play a5, where by playing it in this way, if my opponent plays b5, what happens is that now I have control of the c5 square permanently still, and then I can close down the position afterwards. Whereas by playing d5 here, it's maybe slightly less accurate, just because they can try to play for a5 and then make it so that my opponents commit to b5, and now they do have control of the c5 square. But it's still perfectly fine. However, after d5, my opponent played in a way where their position would not be fine, because they should have played the move knight to b8 and tried to reroute the knight to f6 to at least have some counter pressure on my center, so that at least maybe they can try to, I don't know, at the moment it's actually just, I think, a practically unpleasant position. But probably they should have tried to play for something like rook d8, rook to d7, and just held everything together. But I think practically this is already a very dangerous position. And that's what the Italian kind of does. It gets you into situations where if your opponent is inaccurate, then they can simply find themselves in a heap load of trouble, especially if they don't quite know the plans correctly. And the plans for black in this position are just not very obvious, other than trying to reroute the knight to f6. So just for some analysis, we can take a look. Queen f2, what happens? They should play the move a5 and actually try to play for knight to c5 in this situation. That is their main break. But white can play for a5 here, b5, and knight d2, and the plan, which is not an easy one, the objective plan, which is not an easy one to really understand. I think this is quite a difficult positional exercise, at least from afar, is that they should play c5. And c5, it's not really an intuitive move because you allow two possible ways of capturing. I don't think b takes c5 is maybe the most intuitive move, but it's actually the best move. Because what you do is you try to kind of keep the position clamped and argue that you have real pressure on the king side still. Whereas black is trying to open up the queen side so that they have counter chances there. But after c4, knight d7, they can argue that they're not going to quite commit to closing down the queen side yet. And if you take like this, then this is not a great transformation, just because now black will have ideas of playing d5 and opening up the position in the center, which is not what you want, as white's pieces are concentrated on attacking the king. So that would have been a very interesting way of playing, and it's still, I think, quite practically pleasant for white, and it's just not an easy position to handle as black, which is again why I really think that the Italian opening is a very strong weapon. I played the Italian opening since 2021, and I think it really only got popular in the past 2 or 3 years, especially among top GMs. So just so it's known, I was a fan of the Italian opening before it became cool. Okay, but after I played rook f3, my opponent played queen to e7 back, and this is actually a very decent move, but again, I don't know if they quite understood what their plan was going to be in this position, just because they played them with queen g5, and going back to e7 is kind of, it feels like a waste of tempo, though it is fine. Okay, so here I played the move pawn to d5, closing down the structure, and my opponent played move knight to d8, and knight d8 is really the move that makes things a bit too difficult to handle, because the knight on d8 is just constrained by my d-pawn. However, in the game, I didn't quite understand that there is a nuance that I should be aware of, which is that I should not allow the knight to get access to the c5 square still, by means of knight b7, knight to c5. So what I should have done was play a5 immediately, so that my opponent would have to either take and commit to not really having any play on the queen side and c5 still being under control, or playing b5 and just completely having the position closed down, so they could maybe play for something like c6 or c5 still, but they don't really have control of the c5 square, so they can't go knight b7, knight c5. However, I played the move rook to g3, and here they could have tried to play for a5 and made it so that I would have to give up the c5 square, though I don't have to capture. The best move is definitely to not capture, because I don't want to give up control of the c5 square. This is just a bad way of playing. As you can see, giving up the c5 square is such a bad choice. It's nearly a -1 change in the evaluation of the position, because there's just so much that this knight on c5 does. It takes control of all these squares, and puts pressure on multiple weaknesses for white, whereas those pawns would not be weaknesses if black had gotten the knight to c5, and there's not really any other pieces that would be able to pressure those pawns. Okay, but my opponent played the move king to h8, and here I played queen to e2. It's trying to start an attack now on the queen side. On the king side, they played queen to d7, trying to hit my pawn maybe, and protect against queen g4. But now I finally play a5 because my pawn is under threat. I don't think I quite understood the nuance that I shouldn't be giving up the c5 square, but on b takes I probably would have taken with the knight, but I don't think I played the move for the reason of trying to maintain control of the c5 square. But my opponent did induce me into doing so. I played knight d2, pawn to f5, and this was the critical error. The move that just ended up making the position outright lost. And to be honest, it's kind of a relatively natural move, and it was the main move that I was calculating on my turn, on my opponent's turn, and my turn. But the reason that move, f5, is simply losing is for some concrete positional and tactical reasons. So after the move f5, maybe you can pause if you'd like to figure out the reputation for white. Obviously, it's kind of an unpleasant position, and white and black would like to get this f5 break to work if it does, because if it does, then you kind of open up all of your pieces to at least get back in the game. But in this case, after pawn to f5, I can simply take rook takes f5, takes f5, queen takes f5, and rook f3 is the key move, because black has only a couple options. So if they go queen to a7, then they lose because rook f8 check simply picks up the queen. So they need to go queen g6 or queen to d7, because otherwise if they go queen, say, to d7, then you simply check, and you're just positionally crushing here because this knight on d8 can never move. You're just going to get your knight to e4 and kind of play queen stuff like queen h5, knight to g5 check, and the position is dead lost. So black really has to play the move queen g6 or queen to c2. However, on queen to g6, you still allow the move rook to f8 check, and white can play the move queen f3. And again, this knight on d8 is simply stuck. Black can try to play for rook to b8, but white plays for h4, and this is what I'd kind of seen beforehand, that I could play for h4, h5, and then try to lock out the queen with a move like e4, queen, f5, and creating mating threats. And the main move that I was considering for black here was queen to c2. And this was the move that I had calculated beforehand and found a winning reputation against, because, again, rook f8 check is the kind of intuitive move, but you still have to make sure that black isn't creating too much counterplay against your pawns, even though likely it's kind of not feasible, but just being accurate is a good thing to do. And after rook f8 checking h7, I played the brilliant move queen f3. I'm not sure if it's brilliant, but I thought it was a nice move. And I had seen this move beforehand. So the point is that if black takes this knight on d2, then white can simply play queen f5 check, g6, queen to d7 check, and it's going to be a checkmate. So my opponent cannot actually take my knight, and they cannot take the pawn either for the same reason. So what they have to do is kind of just bring the queen back to maybe hold on, but now I can simply play a move like h4 to attempt to deflect the queen off the diagonal, and after h5, I had seen all the way to this point where I saw that I was getting knight e4, and the position kind of just collapses where my opponent resigned in this position. So the reason they resigned is because, well, they can maybe move the queen, but if they want to, the thing is that at the moment, white is threatening the move knight to g5 check and rook h8, just picking up the queen and then mating. So my opponent kind of has to move the queen, and if they play queen h6, then they're allowing queen to f5 check, and at the very least, after queen g6, there's rook h8 check, picking up the queen. But also I think there's simply like knight to g5 check and to h8, which wins as well. So my opponent can't really play like that, and otherwise they kind of have to try and offer a queen trade with queen to g4, but this doesn't really work out because you can simply take, and play knight to g5 check. And the issue is that after knight to e6, if black captures, rook takes a8, and not only does white have the simple plan of taking this a pawn and just promoting, but actually black's knight is outright trapped. It does not have any squares to go to where it would not be captured. So black would simply be losing the piece and be down a rook, and the position would be lost. That is why my opponent resigned. So hopefully that was a relatively instructive game on kind of how you can take some space on the queen side and slowly break through the opponent's defenses by being more active on the king side and locking things up where you would like to, while creating play in the area of the board where you would also like to be more active. And again, just noting that even though it's the Italian game and it's a slower game, you will get opportunities. And you will get tactical opportunities, things like this, where you end up getting to sacrifice a knight to go for a checkmate. But I think the main takeaway from this game is actually that the thing that didn't happen, which was, or rather, I think there's two takeaways. One, that here you should take on a7 if you have the opportunity to, without the inclusion of h3, h6, I guess, you should try and take on a7 immediately to try and discoordinate black's pieces. But rather, the important thing is that you play h3, h6 first so that you can play knight bd2 and get more development before you choose to capture on a7, so that you have some flexibility. And the second main thing to kind of take away is that playing a move here like d4 is actually a bit inaccurate because of the fact that you destabilize your center after a few moves. So what you really should do is take on e6 if prompted. So after black plays bishop e6, in almost all lines of the bishop c5 Italian, you should be trading on e6, so that if they play f takes, then you just play d4 and take the center. And if they play knight takes here, then you just also play d4. And even here, you're having the threat of forking them with d5. So maybe the most natural move is onto d5 to try and prevent that, but that doesn't actually address the threat, because after e takes d5, queen takes d5, e4, you are still threatening d5. And this is just a bit of an unpleasant situation as well for black. I think like knight to g5 is probably the best move, but you kind of have to accept being in a slightly worse position. Okay, so hopefully that one was instructive. And in the next game, I'm going to be showing, to the extent of my recollection, a game that I drew against an international master. So I drew an international master in an over-the-board blitz game in a tournament a couple days ago. It was a farewell party for one of my friends. He's the international master that I ended up drawing. And we ended up playing an Italian opening. But I don't know if I could fully recall all the moves of this game, so I kind of just put down what I felt like the position kind of resembled. So in this game, you might see the evaluation look a little bit weird, where some of the moves that I inputted were just to try and get to the positions later on. But just the important thing is to focus on the ideas of this game more so than the specific variations that may have arisen. But the reason that I'm including this game is because I think it goes to show just how resilient the Italian opening is as well, because it actually can take a lot of risk out of the situations that you get into because of how solid it is. So we played into the same kind of line in the other game against the 1850, and in this game I did include the moves h3 and h6. Now I played bishop to e3. Again, this is kind of the way of playing that I recommend. And after castles, typically I played my friend before here, so he's played knight to e7, and this is kind of his typical way of playing. And in that game, he ended up beating me, though it wasn't in an official, rather rated over-the-board blitz tournament. But I think because he had played that against me before, he decided to play the move d5. So we ended up getting this kind of situation. And this is also one thing I kind of want to bring up, which is that a lot of times you will see black play for d5 in the Italian opening, and it's not something that you should be afraid of, in my opinion, because if you play it in a specific way, which is the way that I played in this game, so I played queen e2, if you play it in a way where you try to play for pawn to d4, you get a very solid structure with b2, c3, d4, as I kind of mentioned earlier, and you get nice control of the 5 square, while also having your bishop on c5, bishop c4, to put some pressure on the diagonal with this extra central space, so you kind of just get a relatively pleasant position. Now, this was kind of later in the blitz tournament, so I was really just focusing on playing chess where I felt that it would be relatively risk-free, because I didn't want to trust my calculation as much when I was a bit maybe tired, and also over the board is always a little bit different, where you see things kind of differently and you can hallucinate a couple of things at many occasions as well. So here I played knight d2, queen to d6, and the main point I want to make in this game is that I didn't play this opening perfectly. I played it actually a fair bit inaccurately, and despite that, just by incorporating the plans rather than looking at concrete ideas, I was still able to get a relatively reasonable position, even though I ended up playing kind of passively with these moves. Rook to e1, rook takes e1, rook to e8. I played rook f1 to try and create some maybe play on this file, but obviously these moves are quite passive. And despite that, I don't actually think that I ended up playing as passively as it looks in these moves and the way that they're transmitted. This is just kind of what I recall the position getting to. I don't think I played it as passive as it looks in this move order. But what ended up happening was that even though I had played it in a way where I got a passive position, I was still able to get a position that was quite resilient because I understood the ideas of the opening quite well. So here I wanted to try and create some complexities in the game, so I played the move queen to g3, and my opponent took on d2, and I played rook f6. So that was kind of my point, that I'm not losing the piece, I'm winning it back. And he played queen g5, I played rook f3, take, and he played the move rook e2. Now, according to the engine, rook to e1 check is actually stronger, and he would have had quite a good position with rook e1. I don't remember if this was the exact position, so just bear with me, but I think it was maybe somewhat similar to this. I don't feel like he would have missed something as concrete as this. I don't think I would have even missed something as concrete as this, but this is kind of just what I recall. So my opponent played something rook e2, I played knight f5, played g6, knight takes h6 check, king to g7, knight f5 check, and we kind of just got a liquidation of c-pawns, pawn to d5, rook to e8 check, rook to b8, and again we ended up trading quite a few pawns, and we got into an even rook endgame, where my opponent was at the time tied for the lead in the Blitz tournament that we were playing in. So it was round 9 out of 10 in a double round tournament, and drawing in this game meant that he would have been a half point back. He ended up still tying for first, but he was still playing on for a little bit in this position so that he could maybe get some chances, but it ended up just being a draw. So hopefully that just goes to show that even against very strong players, and I believe my opponent was like 2550 USCF, even against very strong players, this Italian opening holds up quite well. It is not just some tricks only opening where you try to put some pressure that is objectively unsound. It's an opening that I think is extremely viable no matter what level you play it at. And I'm only a little bit over 2000 USCF at the moment myself. Probably a little bit underrated, but that is just to kind of just goes to show that even with such a big difference in strength, it doesn't actually change the way that the opening is structured. You can still play it quite well no matter how strong the opponent is. Okay, so those were the two over the board games that I kind of wanted to show in this video, and I'll now go ahead and just quickly go through a couple of online games that I've played that I also think illustrate some of the main themes well, and then we're going to go over a game that was just played in the Cairns Cup yesterday between Fabiana Caruana and Jordan Van Forest. So stick around for that if you would like to kind of look at some of the analysis. And after that, we're gonna be doing some practice games against chess.com bots. I don't really want to try and get a regular online game at the moment, just because I think that for the purposes of instruction, I'd rather have kind of a more controlled environment where my opponents are gonna play the openings that I would like them to. So yeah, but we're gonna go over a couple of these rapid games, and then we're gonna try to implement what we have learned in this video. So in this game, I was 2486 rapid, my opponent was 2329, and we played the Italian opening with knight f6, d3, bishop c5, a4, d6, c3, a5, h3. My opponent in this game did not play h6, and what happened was that after bishop to e3, they played the move bishop to e6, which in my opinion was actually already an inaccuracy. If you take a look at the engine, it's about 0.4, 0.5, okay, 0.4 approximately. And the reason that I think this is not quite the way to play is because you kind of commit to having this structure where I can at any moment take on c5 as well. Now in the game, I didn't take on c5 immediately because I didn't want to. And again, you can see like the engine is still adjusting to the evaluation. It was actually 0.3.4 before, now it's 0.6.7. Which again, this is kind of just to show like even the engine doesn't quite always understand the deep intricacies of the Italian opening, which is why I think it's such a good weapon up to the top levels, because with experience in the opening, you can develop such a good intuition that like even engines can sometimes be a little bit wrong. But after bishop takes e6, pawn takes e6, I think bishop takes c5 is one way of playing, where I could probably played something like queen b3 here. Don't think, yeah, I guess in this case it's not good because just queen takes d3 and then the d4 pawn, the e4 pawn is just very weak. But, oh, apologies. I did not take on c5 because I figured that taking on e3 is still a pretty decent position for me, and I kind of knew the structures relatively well. But I think bishop c5 would have been objectively the strongest way of playing here. Again, you don't need to play the opening perfectly in all cases to make it the best weapon for you. Just gotta remember the ideas. So don't fret too much about missing an opportunity like this. I certainly didn't myself. So, and I guess just to take a look at why this is a little bit bad for black. Note that you do not play a move like c4 in this position, because it's such a weakening move. Like you will see right now, the evaluation is 0.7. If you play the move c4, it's going to jump down to being maybe even -1 for black. Yeah, -1, even worse. Because positionally, you're giving up the d4 square, you're giving up the b4 square. And knight d4 immediately I don't think is quite the best way of playing, but just looking at how much pressure this d pawn is going to be under, how much, like just knight b4 immediately, and I think this pawn is borderline lost. I don't actually see a good way of, you can take on e5, but then I think there should be something like knight to e7. Okay, no, not knight e7, I guess, oh no, queen d6, yeah. Queen d6 is just removing the defender. If f4, then, like, I think knight to e7 is just winning, because after this you can even play knight takes, which is kind of a nice inclusion, because if king e2, then you can take here, and if they go here, then you can take on g2, and now I think check, and you get something like this. Maybe is no. Hold on. So this, and then I think maybe just like queen to g3 is quite strong. So you have queen e3 checkmate coming, and they try to play something like this, then you can just play rook to f2 and you win the queen, and you're mating. So kind of just to illustrate the point, don't play them with c4 like ever. If you have a structure like this, c4 is not always a bad move, but just make sure you're not giving up too many squares in the Italian. The point being that with c4 here, the point being that with c4 here, you're permanently giving up the d4 square. You're not just giving up the d4 square for some time. You can never actually take control of that square back because you have already pushed your e pawn, and your c pawn was the only way of maintaining control of d4. Okay, so we didn't go into this position. We played bishop e6, bishop e6, castles, queen to e8, knight to d2, and we had some central play. We played rook to c1, and again, this is kind of why the Italian opening is so good, because again, the engine is saying that it's a 0.1 position, but for black, but it's not so clear why that's the case, because white has the center. White is playing for moves like d5. Objectively, it might be 0.1, but black has to be very concrete in order to prove that they have something here, which they don't really have something here, but in order to even like combat white's plans. So in this position, my opponent played knight to f4, which I think is a pretty decent move, but I simply took on f4, and then I played pawn to e5. And the best way for my opponent to have played was actually e takes, and knight to e5. No, sorry, not knight e5. I think it would have been knight to e7. No, knight to d4. Because if white takes on d4, then they're simply under some actual pressure with this knight on d2, and I think we're relatively clear this isn't a great transformation. Black can at least take on d5, and you can't really take on c7 with the d2 knight under pressure. So this would have been kind of a strong way for my opponent to play, but even there, I don't have to take on d4. I can simply play something like, I believe rook to e1 should be... No, rook to e1 is actually bad because there's knight f3 and then you have to take with the g pawn at the end. So this is what might happen, and it's not great. But again, this is only if my opponent is finding the precise resource that actually keeps it in the balance. Obviously, you have to find your own resources. You can't just play a chess game and win a position without finding your own good moves. But in this case, black had to find some resources, and I think white can still stay in the game as well by playing something like, I think g3 should... No, g3 maybe lost knight e2 check. But probably rook c4 doesn't... I think maybe you just take on c2. Taking on c2 is probably the best way of playing, because you kind of alleviate the pressure, so that you kind of maybe will have the opportunity to play rook e1 at some point. You can, at least with rook takes c7, you can play something like maybe queen to b1 and try to untangle. So like, say something like rook to d8, you can play queen b1 and queen to d3, and maybe try to make sure that you're not being put under pressure on the d file if you capture on d4, and that rook e1 will maybe be possible in the future. But anyways, this is kind of a more difficult resource in my opinion for black to find than for white, because black kind of has to actually execute it. And my opponent played knight to e7 after about 2 minutes of thought, over 2 minutes of thought, because they didn't quite understand the nuances. And I simply took on c7. My opponent played pawn to e5. Probably they should have taken on d5. I'm not sure why they did not, but I guess queen b3 is a little bit unpleasant. But my opponent played e5, and now the position is closed, and knight to g5 is a nice way of playing for white, because you get the knight to d6 to e6, and white black has to retreat. Here I guess f3 is not quite a great move. Probably something like rook to e1 would have been good, because I think I played f3 just because I didn't want to allow bishop takes. I didn't want to allow bishop takes d2 and then queen takes e4 in this position. But f3 is kind of a weakening move regardless. So I think like there's probably some way of compensating a little bit in this position. Maybe with like queen g3. I'm playing for like knight to g6, knight h4, but again, it's still not clear cut. So I think white is still probably objectively winning. And my opponent played b6. I played queen to c2, and note that a move like knight takes d5 does not work because you simply take, and this queen is not actually under threat. It's defended by the rook on c7. So queen c2, queen h6, knight to d4, and the position kind of begins unraveling. My opponent played bishop to c5 check, and this is kind of just the beginning of the end. So they took on c5 with the d pawn, or they should have taken with the b pawn, so that their pawns on e6 and e5 and d6 would remain at least somewhat protected. But they played queen e3 check after I took on e5, and they played queen f4. I took on f7, and I finished the game as d6 to just force some simplification. So if they play something like this, then I just take. If they take, then I can just play something like queen to h4, and if they take, again, can trade into the rook endgame probably. I think that's just objectively winning because you take the file and you are up a pawn, so any trade is just a winning position. And if they can't trade, then you simply bring your king and slowly win the game. So, yeah, I believe my opponent resigned. I did still have, there was still some things to deal with in the position. I didn't quite play it in the most accurate way, though my opponent was kind of low on time, so I had a bit of liberty to not play it perfectly. And I put move g4, they took on d5, and it's objectively kind of a draw now, but my opponent couldn't quite find the way to hold it with low time, and I took on a5 and ended up just getting my pawns too far advanced where the king would be under too much threat and the g-pawn would fall, so they resigned in this position. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at the last game that I played. We'll try and go through this one a little bit more quickly because I know I've taken some time. So in this game, I was 2383 and I played against a 2250. We played 45, knight f3, bishop c4, tying game. And after a5, castles, d6, h3, h6. Again, I include those two moves. Bishop to e3, pawn takes e3, bishop to e6, pawn takes e6. Again, this is a common theme. They play bishop e6. try to take on e6 because you kind of always allow yourself to have these queen b3 ideas. Note that on queen b3, black can always play queen c8, but there's still just some pressure that lingers on b7 and e6 that they kind of always have to deal with. And your queen is actually relatively healthy and not easy to attack on b3. So here I didn't play queen d3 immediately. I played knight bd2. It's fine to just develop a little before you play those moves. My opponent played pawn to d5, and after queen c8 here to try and be prophylactic and protect the b7 and e6 pawns, I played the move pawn to d4, and this is already a little bit unpleasant for black because yes, they can take on e4, but this is not the best pawn to capture because white can take on e5 at least, and then if black takes back, then you win a pawn. Although black can capture on e3, and then there's still some stuff to deal with, but after rook takes f8, the king has to capture, and even though it looks like this position is kind of equal, it's not. Go ahead and take a look at the analysis. It's plus 1.9, it's plus 2 because of this move knight to c5. Maybe there's some other move, but knight to c5 hits both the b7 pawns and the e6 pawns. So black cannot really capture on e4, and my opponent instead took on d4. And oh, apologies. So my opponent took on d4, and I took back. And here again, it's a pawn sacrifice. In this case, this is a better version for black, but it's still not great because after knight to h4, black can maybe try to sack the pawn with e3, and it's kind of a weird thing where the best way for playing for black is just pushing this pawn and letting it get suffocated so that black has time to coordinate their own defense. I don't think queen is good. Can't push it all the way down the board, but after rook f2, maybe queen to d7, still not an easy position for black to deal with. But my opponent didn't play it that way. They played the move king to h7, and this is also another common theme in the Italian, that this diagonal, this b3 to g8 diagonal, while it is often the main diagonal that you will use that creates a lot of pressure towards the black position, the black king is not safe on h7 either in most cases, because generally it'll go to h7 if the h6 pawn is included. But the reason that it's not safe is because you can simply transition back and play queen c2, and not only do you have pressure point on f7, you also have a pressure point on g6, which is kind of why the black position can come under fire so easily, because black just has so many weaknesses in the Italian that they have to deal with. Apologies, I think this is okay. Sorry, I thought my computer is maybe a little bit slow. But yeah, like all these pressure points in the Italian, I think it's just such a thematic thing where if you know how to exploit it, if you kind of learn the opening well, you will be able to put your opponents under quite a bit of pressure in almost all of your games. And I think there's not really much more you can ask from an opening, in my opinion. Sometimes you might want to play more dynamically, but if you want to win chess games, I think the Italian game is such a great tool to have at your disposal. Okay, so queen c2, knight to e7, knight takes e4, and my opponent ended up having some issues here because after rook takes f8 check, the queen recapturing would allow queen takes e6 check, just winning a pawn, and if they recapture the king, which is what they did, positionally after queen h7, the game is over because they can try to maybe prevent rook f1 from being as strong by playing knight f5, but it doesn't actually work out because at the very least you can still play rook f1 and knight takes f5 is on the cards, rook takes f5, and the position will simply collapse. Oh, apologies. And after queen h7, my opponent played c5. The general threat is now just rook f1 and taking on g7 with the threat of rook f8, check, winning the queen. And there's not much you can do about it, because even if you want to avoid losing the queen, playing king d7 still runs into knight g6, where there's just too much pressure on the knight, and the position also collapses in this line as well. So after c takes d4, I played rook to f8 check, king to d7, queen takes d4 check, not immediately recapturing the queen, just to be accurate. My opponent played knight to d5, queen to g7 check, king to c6, rook takes c8 check, and after knight to g6, my opponent resigned, just because at the very least I can trade knights, for example, and it's just a winning position being able to play for a rook. Okay, so hopefully those games that I played were somewhat instructive. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I can try to address them. You can point to some specific moments in the games if you'd like to. But we'll go ahead and move on to a game that was played just yesterday between Fabiano Caruana and Jordan Van Forest. Jordan Van Forest I think he's been in pretty good form in 2026, at least in the early part of 2026. I know that in this past tournament he didn't do quite as well. He played in the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz, unless I'm mistaken. But in this game, as you can see, Fabi did play the Italian game, and he played it quite well. But I actually would like to say something about this game that obviously I'm not remotely on the same level as Fabiano Caruana, not even close. But I would like to make a comment about the way that he played the game, where I think that maybe in the opening it could have been it could have been a little bit more accurate to play it in a certain move order, at least thematically. And so we'll go ahead and look at the game. Fabi played e4, and we got the Italian game. Knight to f6, pawn to d3, bishop to c5, c3, castles, pawn to d5. So we haven't had a look at an Italian game with d5 yet, so I think this is a good one to go over. And after d5, e takes d5, knight takes d5, rook to e1, bishop to g4, knight to d2, knight b to d2, knight to b6, and Fabiano played h3, bishop to h5, bishop to b3. And this is kind of where I want to make my comment, because obviously I can see the engine, and we can all see the engine. I don't want to pretend that I'm seeing this as somebody that's stronger than Fabi. I'm not remotely, but just from an objective standpoint, Fabi was sacrificing this pawn in order to play for this tactic with knight takes e5. Now, I don't think this is actually a worse position for Fabi. I think the engine just needed some time to run, but I still think that this may have been a slightly inaccurate way of playing the Italian, just based on my own experience and some concrete analysis here, that, as you can kind of see, Fabi, he has a solid setup to an extent, but also Black has some activity with the bishop on c5, eyeing the king. The queen and bishop are quite close to the white king as well. Black is relatively solid with these two knights, and white is kind of passive with the knights on d2 and f3 being under a little bit of pressure. So I think even though this is a good position for Fabi objectively, it's also not like the easiest thing to play practically. Even though he's Fabiano Caruana, so he will end up winning this kind of position no matter what. And just to note, like, if you look at his time usage, I think he was himself a little bit stumped by the situation, because he spent 4 minutes, and Fabi is obviously one of the most well-prepared players in the world, so him spending a few minutes kind of indicates he's probably out of prep. But you can kind of see black is somewhat active, and I think Fabi had to take some time to come up with a solution just because it's not an easy one to find out. And I guess in this case, it's really about the fact that Jordan doesn't have any concrete avenues to actually making use of the pressure he has towards the king. Now, maybe there's this move knight to d5, which could be strong with rerouting to f4, but white can play knight to e4, and I guess Jordan didn't really want to go into this position, and I guess Fabi was fine with it, but this is not a great position for white, in my opinion, just because, yes, you have the bishop pair, but these double pawns are always going to be a bit of a nuisance, and you will have to create some concrete compensation and maybe have to play for a draw, even though the engine says that white is a little bit better. I think they are, but kind of hard to play for a win. And the reason that I wanted to make a comment here was because objectively, I think that a better setup for Fabi might have been to play with a4. Not rookie one, I think here is fine, but like a4 would, I think, have been a very decent way of playing, because with knight b6 you can play the move bishop to b3, and at least now your d pawn is defended in this line, so there's just not quite as much pressure on the d file. But also, I think it maybe is better to even start with a4. Apologies. I think maybe even better to start with a4 earlier at this moment. Just because, sorry, not here. At this moment. So a4, d5, take, and castles, and you kind of have some more flexibility now to play bishop to g4, because you can play a move like h3, bishop to h5, and I think knight bd2 is quite strong, because now you have knight to e4 and knight to g3. This is the way that I typically play such a position. Obviously, I'm not saying that Fabi didn't do his homework, but what I am saying is that I think that there are some subtleties that even top grandmasters can overlook a little bit. Okay, so after, so this is not what happened in the game. Fabi ended up going into this position, which I don't think he wanted to quite go into it. But after bishop to b3, this is definitely a cool pawn sacrifice, and I guess this is kind of what separates grandmasters from regular players, which is that even in situations where they don't have all the experience of playing such an opening, I don't think this is like Fabi's main weapon. He probably plays the royal opens a little bit more, but even in openings where they're not perfectly versed in all of the ideas, they can still okay, it's Fabi, so he's probably perfectly versed in all of the ideas, but even in openings where they end up in kind of situations where they didn't want to, they can still find concrete avenues to actually keeping the game going in a nice way. So, in my opinion, I personally don't like to play it like this in the Italian opening, just because I feel like when you have these concrete situations, it often favors black, because they did play in kind of an active way of development. But that's my own personal preference. Doesn't really mean anything when Fabi is the one that is at the wheel. Okay, so after knight to f3, queen to e2, Jordan played queen to c8, which makes sense. Just trying to bring the rook to e8, rook f to e8, and after queen to f1, Jordan played the move bishop to g6, which is definitely an interesting move. Probably trying to play for bishop to d3, which at the moment would trap the queen. So Fabi played the move knight to e4, which I think is kind of a poor move. And after knight e4, bishop to e7, bishop to f4, rook to e8, rook to e2. Apparently Jordan may have had to move knight to a5 here. Bishop c2, maybe there's some knight c4, and you kind of get a typical weakening of the queenside pawn structure, as you might see in, for example, like the knight orf, where you definitely don't want to play b3 because you allow knight a3 and the bishop is kind of just stranded, and positionally it's not ideal. So after knight a to c4, sorry, this is not what happened. After this, Jordan, I guess, maybe he rejected knight to a4 because after this, probably saw something like knight to g3, and if you take on b2, then you can simply take on g6 and win the piece back, and if they take on c2, then you can just take, and I think this is probably a fine position for black. But here, Fabi played the move rook a to e1, and after knight to a5, bishop to c2, I guess Jordan maybe didn't quite time it correctly, because here, after knight h4, I think if you take on b2, then you have some concrete issues with knight takes g6, h takes g6, and bishop to g5, where if you play f6, then I think just bishop f6, and this is a crushing position where you're simply winning everything. And if something like rook to d7, then you have, I think, knight to f6 check at least, and then you win the exchange. Also, you should have bishop h6 coming, so kind of, oh, I guess it's rook d8, so you don't just immediately win, or rather, you don't just immediately win more material, but yeah, I guess like bishop to d7 also loses because bishop takes e7 and then knight f6 as well. So Jordan kind of ran into some concrete issues with that after knight h4. So he could not just take on b2, which probably he was trying to understand. But after bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, Jordan played the move knight to d6. And again, it's useful to just look at why it is that Jordan ended up in a bad situation here. The reason, I think, is because this knight on e4 ended up being quite strong. If you kind of recall, in these d5 Italians, you will often get a knight to e4, and it is why the d5 Italian can be a little bit risky to play for black, because this knight on d4 can have quite a few roles, because it can easily participate in the attack through something like knight to g5, and it can just help take space quite easily, and it's not a piece that can be easily disrupted. So by playing around the knight on e4, Fabi ended up getting quite a strong position because Jordan couldn't really remove it without making some big concessions. So I guess Jordan's big mistake was probably knight to c4, knight a to c4, which is definitely not an intuitive one. I guess he should have apparently played f6 or knight to d5, which knight to d5 makes some sense because at least you're getting more active and compensating the fact that this knight on e4 is taking some space. You can at least take some space yourself with this knight on d5, but again, it's why I think this d5 Italian is risky, because even though white has kind of a nice positional edge, and f6 I don't think is an intuitive move at all. Maybe the point is that you have this bishop on g6 defending this rook on e8 additionally, so maybe some tactics stop working out, but again, it's very concrete, and it's much easier to play from the white side because you have to find some concrete ways of equalizing as black that white just gets to press against. So after this, Jordan's move knight c4 was probably the big mistake. Maybe not a losing mistake, but he got under some severe pressure due to it. And then after knight to d6, bishop takes d6, bishop takes d6, Fabi had this move, bishop takes b7, which is quite nice because if you take, then you simply lose the rook. So Jordan played the move queen to d7. It's down to 4 minutes, and it looks like his position is kind of collapsing. Fabi played the move knight to f3, rook takes e2, queen takes e2, keeping the file controlled. And after the move c6, Fabi simply played bishop a6, g6, queen to e4, knight to d5, and after bishop to c4, queen to c7, king to f1, bishop to c5, g3, a5, rook to e2. Fabi is really just getting a positional bind against Jordan, and he's slowly outmaneuvering him. Jordan is trading rooks, and then Fabi now has additional weaknesses to target. Again, this is like the principle of two weaknesses. He has an extra pawn, but also now this a pawn is quite weak, and then this king is also quite weak. So something like knight to d4 can create some threats, and the position is beginning to collapse. After bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5, a4, queen to a8, and b4, which is, I think the reason that this works is because after a takes, c takes, if takes, then you have the move queen to e8 check, which if black simply blocks with bishop to e7, knight to d4 check, and if king to e5, then you simply play knight to c6 check, and you can trade everything off into a winning pawn endgame, where you get something like this. I think a5 should be good, and then black is simply too far away, though this is definitely still concrete, but you end up attacking the f-pawn, and you get something like this, where black is just a bit too slow to actually getting back. And otherwise, you get the same situation effectively if you walk with the queen, because if they go here, then you simply fork, and it's just even worse. So if you played king to d6 here, then you get forked here, and then if you played king to d6 here, then you can trade, and then you get forked. So I think that's why pawn to b4 concretely worked out, and now Fabi simply has two passers. I guess Jordan ended up taking on b4. No, Fabi didn't play queen to e8. Interesting. But knight to d4, king to d7, queen takes d5 check, queen to d6, queen to b7 check, and now should be relatively simple, where Fabi will probably just end up pushing his a-pawn at some point when he's ready, or create some counterplay against the king first, and Jordan doesn't really have much he can do. Knight to d5 check. Now I think he's probably, yeah, okay, so here he plays queen to e3, and the threat is at least playing knight takes f5, just winning an additional pawn. So after bishop to h6, you can play, sorry, knight takes f6 is what I meant. Knight takes f6 check, and you will win, I think, even another pawn after that. You can take on h7, no forks of the knight, and Fabi is simply winning, and it was in this position that Jordan resigned. Okay, so hopefully that was also an instructive game to just go over, that in the d5 Italian, you can try to win some tempi against the black pieces because of the way that they're coordinated, and the fact that black is kind of committing to giving up a central pawn that white can try to exploit by taking advantage of the center with their own pieces. Okay, so that was a nice game by Fabi, and I think we'll go ahead and play a couple of practice games against maybe a 1500 rated bot to try to exercise this opening. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look. I think, yeah, so Wendy is 1500, and we can go ahead and play her. Hoping that she ends up playing into the Italian. Okay, so we played move e4, play c5, okay, that's good. So now we should get Italian if she doesn't play Petrov. Yep, okay, bishop c4. And she plays with knight f6, okay. So now we play d3, bishop c5. Yeah, so we're getting kind of our main kind of Italian. Let's see, so she ends up playing this d5. And we take here on d5. Oh, that's a bit weird. Yeah, this is definitely not the way to play. You can at least, as white, take on c6, and after e takes f3, you can simply take the queen. I don't think I've ever seen something like this before, to be honest, but it's definitely not a good way of playing. Also, maybe even just queen to e2 is, I think, reasonable enough. Or we can play pawn takes, knight takes, castles, and then if they move the knight... I am kind of curious what the best refutation here is, though. Maybe takes, knight takes, queen to e2. And then if bishop takes f2, there's not actually anything because we can simply play king f1. And so the pawn takes, knight takes, queen e2, queen e7. We take on c6. And if bishop f2, we play king f1. There's no real threat, so I think that should work out. We can simply take. Okay, so I guess they're just admitting that they don't really have a way of playing this, and I think I'm just wondering if we should castle or if we should play knight to c3. I think maybe knight to c3 should be good. Don't really see any issues with that. Just want to be careful that we're not being too hasty about the c2 pawn. I would like to just castle if I can, but knight to c3 is fairly useful. Bishop g4 is a move, but here I think we can simply castle. If they take, then we just take back, and then rook e1 would have skewered the queen to the king, and now I think simply bishop to g5, and we are just in a winning position. Again, this here I always like to kind of try to be as accurate as possible. So if we have a move like e5 that might be potentially winning, why not just calculate it? So e5, bishop takes f3, we can play e takes f6. They would take our queen, I believe. And then we would take on e7, and I think that's winning. So e5 should be winning, because otherwise, if they take on f3 takes, and they take back with the pawn, then we simply play... Or hold on, sorry. So e5, bishop f3, e takes f6. If they take back with the pawn, we can play queen takes f6. They would take back with the g pawn, and then there I think we simply play something like knight to e4. Again, it's we are still even pieces, so we're doing well enough on material, so I think e5 is winning. take, and then we get this. And now we simply play against the king. And here we win the queen. So relatively clean game here, I think. I think queen to c3 check is pretty reasonable. And we can just finish things off with knight to g3. g1. Position is completely winning, so can pretty much get away with anything, but play queen to bishop to e3, and then I think this is good enough. Go ahead and play this, and they can play knight to f4, but doesn't really do anything after knight to maybe I should have been a little bit accurate, but it's an exchange and not really gonna matter in the grand scheme of things, so I'll go ahead and just allow them to take that. Yeah, that's a bit too much, I think. Probably we can just play rook to b1, and now maybe something like this, just looking to completely take away any avenues for the black king. And here we can just bring the rook in. So go ahead and bring the rook up, checkmate, and after knight takes, we can play queen to f6. Oh, okay. Play queen f6 anyways, and this will be a checkmate. Okay, so relatively clean game on that one. I think we can just go ahead and take a game review. So, okay, 90.3 accuracy, relatively decent, looks like. Curious why it said the opening was inaccurate. I guess that's not a good sign if I'm promoting the opening specifically in this video, but I don't think it was really inaccurate. I think it was good. Engine probably just being harsh. So bishop c4, 3, and I guess it's maybe because of just how Wendy played, where she got into such weird complications. And yeah, I guess knight c3, it's calling inaccurate and saying that's part of the opening. I don't think that's really quite fair, but anyways, yeah, I think it looks like a pretty clean game. Not really any issues. Okay, so let's go ahead and play another one. Apologies. And I think we can just play against Wendy one more time. So, okay, in this one, actually, I think what I'll do is I will go to analysis and set up, I don't want to get the same opening, so I'm going to set up a regular Italian where we have bishop to c5, and they don't play d5, so we'll say like d6, and we can try and play this position. So hopefully we can do that, and then we'll do one more game after this with the bishop e7 line. And then I'll also mention the g6 variation that they can play. So yeah, let's go ahead and change the bot. Don't want to play against maximum. Go ahead and play against Maria. Oh, sorry, we can play against... Maybe we'll do a slightly stronger bot for this one. Though I hesitate to play against the strongest bots for these instructional videos, just because they can always vary a little bit in strength, but we can play against Wally. Okay, so we will play, I think, pawn to a4. So again, just to mention, kind of curious why the engine is on. Don't really want that. piece. My computer's being a little bit slow. But okay, let's set that up again. Okay, so 45, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, bishop c5, d3, d6, and we can search this Wally. Hopefully, change the settings to. Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay, so no new feedback and no evaluation. All right. Okay, so we'll play pawn to a4. Oh no, sorry, it's maximum. We'll change the bot because I'm sure Wally would probably play something like this anyways. Yeah, so here we go, Wally. And yes, we'll play move pawn to c3, setting up b4 and a5. Fortunately, we're getting a similar type of Italian where they play d5, but it is slightly different because they did already commit to the move d6. So here we'll play castles, and Wally's playing this in a bit of a weird way because now we can put some pressure on the d6 pawn, and just play for knight to e2, knight to d2, and knight to e4. Now, again, this is kind of a weakening move as well because Wally is opening up this c4 to g8 diagonal, and one theme that is good to know in these positions is that you can play the move. Looks like we have some thunderstorms outside, but you can play the move onto a5 to play for queen to b3, because if you play queen b3 immediately, then you're met with the move knight to b5, knight to a5, which is a little bit unpleasant. Because you don't really want to give up the bishop, although I guess you probably have like queen a2 here, and then after knight takes, you have knight takes c4, and winning the pawn. So that is actually kind of interesting, but I think they can probably also just play bishop to e6, and they retain the threat of knight to a5 to an extent, so we can probably just go ahead and try to play forward pawn to a5. Okay, interesting. The move knight to f4 makes an appearance. And I think probably we'll go ahead and play the move knight to f1. No reason to allow anything particularly weird. And yeah, this is... I've been getting some weird play in these games. So I think we'll play knight to g3, and okay, so Wally castles, which again, it's kind of not the thing you'd expect, just because this knight is under quite a bit of pressure, and I think maybe there's even some concrete ways of exploiting that with the move pawn to d5, but then there's maybe e4. Okay, so I think what we'll go ahead and do is I'd like to play the move bishop to g5. I think that's kind of a nice move. So I think we can go ahead and play that, but then maybe there's king h8 after that. So, definitely some interesting play here. Oh, so okay, maybe if we played pawn to d4 after e5, we can at least play d5. And then if it takes, probably take back the queen. No, but then there's knight to e5. Getting some interesting positions here, so I think we'll go ahead and play the move queen to b3, just because I'd like to keep some pressure on the b7 pawn as well, and I'd also like to kind of keep the knight to g5 in the air, but I don't think I'm actually getting quite as nice of a position as I'd hoped. At least quite as clear of a position as I'd hoped. So Really, the main issue here is trying to develop this d2 bishop, because if we go bishop e3, then we allow pawn to f5, then maybe there is knight to e4, but kind of iffy. And if we play pawn to d4, then we're allowing pawn to e4. And it's not so obvious what's going on. So another idea is we could play the move bishop to d5 and then try to take on c6 and then play knight takes e5, which I think is somewhat reasonable. But then maybe on bishop d5 they can play bishop to f6 and try to just... Oh, but no, bishop s6, then we can play knight takes f5. So I think this is probably the way to go. They can play this move knight to c5, but I guess I can probably just play the move queen to c4, because b4 we can play en passant. But yeah, this is definitely getting tricky, and it's not quite what I wanted. Hopefully I'm not missing anything. Yeah, okay, so to play this, I think we can just take, and now maybe pawn to d5 is still in the air, but we can also... Yeah, it's definitely throwing me a bit for a loop. Okay, so I think we'll play b3, because now after rook d8, which I did see, what my point was here is that they can't really take on d3 because we can just take on e6. So I think we can just play this bishop to a3, which I think is quite strong. And now I think we simply have to move pawn to d5. That should simply win a piece. So we can go ahead and play it. Yep. And just to be accurate, let's... Yeah, I think we can just take and then play rook takes. Always a little bit tricky with these spots, but we can go ahead and play rook to b1 and does bishop to b2 win material here? I think so. I don't see a way for black to proceed. And now we can just go ahead and play knight to e4. Knight to d6, and I think a move like a knight takes is good. Play rook here. And trade rooks. Go ahead and play to d1. And I think pawn takes f3 is good. Apologies, I think I'm gonna go head to the bathroom. But we'll finish up this game in 1 minute. Okay, so hopefully if you have been watching this long, you found that to be an okay break. Yeah, so here we can simply take on d3, and we'll go ahead and go to d7, and then take on a7. We can take on f3, but we can just go ahead and move. I think to be clean, we'll probably simply play something to a8, and okay, maybe we can go ahead and play rook to a5 and try and set up a checkmate here on b8. We can now get in a little bit and play here to a7 and king to f3. I think it's reasonable. And play this. Take here and reasonable. And go here, here. And let's just go ahead and sacrifice the rook for the pawn. And we'll just take, and we'll just push the pawn. So there we go. I think that was a relatively decent win against Wally, but it was quite tricky in the early opening. I wasn't really understanding what was going on. Yeah, like d5 here is just not really supposed to be a good move, but I didn't quite punch it in the correct way, because apparently you're supposed to play this move queen to b3 right now, which I would have thought maybe ran into knight a5. But there's queen to b5 check concretely, and the bishop or knight is going to be lost. And if they play the move bishop to e6, could play queen takes b7, and just win a pawn. If they play knight f6, you can take on f7, king f8, and bishop c4 back, and you just want a pawn as well. And we're into the king of the casting right. So that is definitely an interesting thing to keep in mind, that playing d6 and d5 is just concretely bad for those reasons. I don't think I've ever seen that pattern before, so I'm myself learning some new things as well in making this. But we can go ahead. So here we castled, and then after bishop to e7, which I thought was weird, but I couldn't quite put a handle on how I'm supposed to fully take advantage of this, because queen d6 and you are defending, and with bots they're always a little bit resilient at moments that you don't expect. And here I played the move a5, knight to f4, and knight f1, and it was good, it seems. But queen to b3 was a mistake, so I should have apparently played the move b4, which I kind of considered, but I just thought it was a bit slow. But I guess the point is that you're simply going to play for b5, and then knight takes e5. And if they play a move like pawn to a6, you can play for bishop to a3, and you just get very active along the diagonals. Okay. So that's good to know. Queen b3, I guess, was inaccurate. So I played bishop to d5, and queen c4, which, yeah, I definitely didn't quite play this in the way that I should have. There's also maybe some knight takes d3 stuff here, which looks kind of scary, but there's e4, and I think this is perfectly fine for white. I guess there's knight to e5 there, but bishop to f4 is good here first. Conclusion. Okay. And after bishop to e6, simply took on e6, and pawn to b3 was reasonable. Apparently, I guess d4 was working out here, which I kind of thought it might be, but I wasn't quite sure. Oh, okay, I think I see. Okay, so the point is that you actually win two pieces on pawn to d5, because after pawn takes f3, you play rook takes e6, and after queen moves, say queen to d7, you simply take on c6. And they actually just end up losing 2 pieces instead of 1. And if they move, say, one of the pieces immediately, then after takes, you can play the move bishop to f4, and you positionally break through. So yeah, a lot of subtleties here. So definitely an interesting one to analyze. But okay, we didn't end up going for this. We ended up going for b3 to try and play bishop a3, and Wally played knight to c5, which I guess it missed the move knight. It missed the move pawn to d4. I think. Simply that this bishop on e7 ends up hanging, and also the knight on c5 ends up being loose. I think I also played slightly inaccurately in my execution, I thought. No, apparently it was good, but we ended up just winning the rook, and then it was a relatively clean conversion from there. Yeah. So, yeah, that was a pretty interesting game, and I think we'll go ahead and do one last game where we play against the bishop to e7 Italian. I guess just a move order note. I think typically you will see the move knight to f6 first, and then after d3, you will get I guess d6 here allows some knight g5 stuff, which is actually bad. So typically they'll simply play bishop to e7 now. Gonna bring this variation to the top. Okay, so bishop to e7, and then yeah, I think this would just be the position that we'd like to play. Though sometimes engines will try to play for d5, so I think maybe what we should do is be okay with playing a4 and then d6, and then going to that position. So yeah, let's go ahead and play against a computer. Set this to Wally. Okay, so here we go. We can play the move. Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are 2 different setups that you can play. You can kind of try to play for knight to c3, bishop to g5, and trying to take control of the d5 square, or you can play for c3 in a way that is kind of a normal Italian. I think I like the move c3 in these situations, and bishop to a2 here makes sense. And this is kind of a bit of a waste of time by Wally, I think, because all it did was attack my bishop and then have it move back, just moved its knight back, where I think my bishop on a2 is actually relatively well placed here, because now it can't be targeted by any of these tempo winning moves. So I think we can just go ahead and just so I'm playing this accurately as well, I think we'll play the move pawn to h3. Yeah, pawn to h3 I think is reasonable, and we can go ahead and castle to e1, and we'll play for the move pawn to d4. But I'm just want to make sure this is the right moment to actually play for it. I think this makes sense, because if we play d4, then take, and we do get it square for our knight on c3 to develop itself. And yeah, I guess if they don't want to take, then we can just play it like this. I think... Okay, so they're trying to attack the structure with pawn to b4 here. So we can't really just allow them to take, because if we take back, then there's some knight takes d5, knight takes d4 stuff. So I think what we should do is just take, and then play knight to f1. Be okay with b4 if it comes, because I think b4, maybe there's even some d5 stuff where we might win a pawn. But yeah, we can go ahead and play knight to, or I think we'll play knight to g3, so that we can at least play for bishop to e3 in the future. And I think, so here's kind of a moment where it's a good thing to note where you might be inclined to take with the knight, you might be inclined to take with the pawn. I think it's probably better to take with the knight in this situation. Though both moves are perfectly fine, I think. But I slightly prefer taking with the knight just because I think that giving up the b4 square is kind of an issue. And the fact that knight b4 actually just hits the bishop where the rook is pinned is kind of unpleasant. And maybe it's even concretely losing. I thought we had queen b3 there, but I think... No, okay, so bishop e6, then we have d5. So maybe it's not concretely losing, but I just don't think it's quite as good, so we can play knight takes. And we don't need to be in a big rush to try and take the center. Like, black, in many cases, will just want to take on d4 just because the knight on d4 itself is quite strong. And it can be a little bit easier to fight back at the center than it can be to get rid of that knight. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and play this move knight g2 f5 now, and try to create some semblance of attack, but I think here... Okay, this is interesting. So, I wonder if we could play something like bishop takes h3, pawn takes, and then like bishop f7 and sack a piece. But don't think there's really any need to do that. Probably also simply play... So, I think probably black's next move is going to be knight takes d4 if we don't really do something specific. And then the question is, do we want to recapture with the pawn or with the knight there? Because we allow some b5 stuff, but it's a little bit double-edged. And we don't... I'm not sure if we want to allow bishop takes f5. It's definitely a decision to make. I think... Yeah, so I think I'd rather actually take with the pawn in that situation, because if we take with the knight, then c5, c4 can sometimes shut down the bishop. So I think that bishop f4 is probably the best move, because actually, okay, so maybe we will end up taking with the knight, but I think bishop f4 is the best move, just because if on knight takes d4, they played f5, c5, then at least we kind of have some pressure on the diagonal. And probably we could play something like knight to f5, bishop takes f5, pawn takes f5, and we maybe add some tactics like rook takes e7 and rook takes d7, bishop takes d6. So I think probably would have been a good position. But here, curious, should we maybe take on d5 and play knight f3? Take on e5 and play knight f3. That seems like a reasonable option to me. We'll go ahead and do that. Yeah, so they played like this. And it's kind of an unstable position for black, I think. So we can just play something like queen c2. And now the pawns become quite weak. So we can take on f7, we can also take on e5. Which one do I prefer? I probably prefer taking on e5, just because the black is kind of threatening position to maybe play e4, so if we can get them to give up the bishop, it's probably better. And here I think we just bring the rook back, and we are up a clean pawn. And yeah, so we have a pretty reasonable position. We can play queen to e2, I think, and maybe try to put some pressure. So wait, oh, did I just blunder? Oh, that's unfortunate. Yeah, so I playing a little bit hastily and kind of allowed black to win piece here. Maybe not the end of the world, but it's not good, yeah. But we can go ahead and try to play like this, I think. So rook to... Okay, so rook to e7 with blunder made. Fortunately. Maybe we should try to play for... b4... Yeah, I definitely wish I didn't do that. Maybe g3, rook takes b2, rook to e7, maybe king to g8, maybe rook to b7. I think I'll go ahead and try that. Okay. We have some interesting stuff here, so let's calculate. They're going for some mating attack against our king. Rook takes, rook b1, check, king to g2, queen to d1, queen takes f6, there's queen h1 mate. Yeah, unfortunately, this looks like it probably works out for black. Okay, yeah, this is a bit unfortunate, but play... Just go rook one back is probably what we have to do. And rook to f1. Probably king g2. Yeah. Bot is finding quite a few strong moves here. Not much you can do about that. Definitely I'd like to find some counterplay, but don't know if I can. Try this. Oh yeah, this still works out. Okay, I think we'll try and play this again. So yeah, that was a bit unfortunate. I don't think I was just being a bit hasty. Position was just pretty winning, but it's getting a little bit late here, so see if we can finish up this video with a good win. Yeah, so let's go ahead and play pawn to h3, pawn to c3, bishop to a2. Okay, so this is interesting. So black is putting some pressure on our a pawn, which is definitely an interesting way of playing. I think we can play pawn to b3, rook to e1, and go ahead and... Yeah, this is not typically the way to be played. It's always a little bit weird playing against these bots because they don't play like humans. Can't quite execute all the ideas that you want sometimes, but we'll take and try and play for this. And we'll probably take to d5 and we'll take, check, take, d7, back to, okay, might have to accept the damaging of the structure here. Go ahead and... Okay, I thought they're going to take on f3. Taking on f3 like this is a bit weird. I guess I could have taken the g pawn, but I think it's probably just better to take with the queen. Play rook to d1. Okay, yes, we have kind of an equalish endgame in this position. We can play rook to c2, to 4. Get some pressure on the position. Because now if they play there, then we end up getting a checkmate, so we can go like this. And play like bishop 2. So I think we'll go ahead and trade and play right to c8. Go for descending. At least I can't lose this kind of situation, which is really the main thing that I want against a bot, where it can be a little bit tricky to play against sometimes. But as long as you can get a position where you can just grind it down, then typically it won't find all the counterplay. Obviously, I don't want to play this like I'm just playing against the fact that it's bot, but sometimes I have to work with the game as it's given to you. Play f3 and taking, I think, is good. So I wonder if we play bishop to h5 and they take, can we take, are we faster, g4, h5, b4, h5, b5, end up both promoting. So b4, no, I think we actually end up winning, yeah? So after bishop h5, knight takes f3, take, b4, h5, b5, h4, b6, h3, b7, h2, and then after b8 queen, h1 queen, we skewered the queen with queen to b7 or queen to a8. So I think that should be a win after bishop to h5. Okay, so they play like this. I think we can just play. Okay, so bishop to g4. There's some trickiness. I guess we can try maybe just play like this then. Oh, this is kind of a resource, so let's go here. We can go just here though now. And now I think they're running out of resources, so we can just play push, and this is gonna end up being a win. Yeah. Okay, it doesn't really matter even if they catch us, but they're too slow. Just want to make sure not stalemating. And here we go. We play. Let's bring the king in. And checkmate. Okay. Yeah, so I think we can go ahead and review that one. And yeah, I think it was a relatively clean game. I think maybe I made a couple of inaccuracies, but yeah, b3 is this kind of setup, even though it looks kind of passive, is not actually that bad for white. Just because black kind of coordinated their pieces in a bit of a passive way, where they're only really focused on one target, and if we just address that target, yeah, we're making our own bishop a little bit passive now, but it can reroute, and black's pieces just look a little bit weird. So after queen b8, we took, pushed, and knight c3. Yeah, this was all good, but I think I somehow messed it up a little bit by playing for rook e7 and not finding the best response here. I guess, yeah, knight to e5 would have been a nice move here, because if they take, then we can... Oh, I thought that we could take here and then just... Oh, that's queen d6, sorry. So we can, I guess, just take here, and then we hit the rook and we hit the bishop. Okay, so, yeah, but rook to e5 is not the best way of playing. Yeah, I thought they would simply play bishop takes f3 here, because the structure is now damaged, and we're definitely not doing great here. But ended up getting this situation. And took on c5, c8, and got a winning endgame after trading rooks. I think it was simply a win, like, probably all the time. Okay, apparently here, king c5, yeah, I guess I should have just kept the king kind of cut off. Maybe bishop to b5 would have been good, just so knight to c5, knight to c6 we can always just trade, and then we're kind of just keeping everything in stasis. But yeah, okay, it's not an obvious win, I suppose, but yeah, ended up getting it to a relatively clean position, where, yeah, here what I had calculated was on knight takes, pawn takes, king takes, we ended up winning the race, or we don't end up winning the race, rather, but we end up using the fact that the king is on f3 to our advantage to skewer the queen. But yeah, I kind of miss that they can just try to repeat the position. Anyways, it doesn't really matter, because with these two pawns and the king versus the knight, as long as we can sack our bishop for the pawn, we're always going to be winning, I believe. So after this, we simply pushed and ended up getting a winning position where we checkmated promptly. Okay, yeah, so that was a relatively interesting game. Hopefully it was relatively instructive on how you can play against this kind of setup. Though yeah, definitely black played in a bit of a weird way. But yeah, also apparently, yeah, here you can play the move pawn to b4, which is very interesting, because I guess after bishop takes a4, you can even play the move queen takes a4, because you have this bishop takes f7, bishop takes f7 check, where you end up picking the queen back up. But I think even bishop takes a4, you can start with bishop takes f7, and if they play rook f7, then you play rook a4, and after this you have knight to g5 and queen to b3 stuff. Or rather, oh, knight to e6, and you end up forking. So that's also a very interesting way of playing as well. Knight to c6, yeah. And that's, I guess, why they have to take with the queen. And you just end up getting a pretty nice position. I guess for instance, knight b3, but then there's knight g5, and the queen is unable to maintain defense. Okay, so yeah, that's also kind of a good thing to note, that pawn to b4 is sometimes an idea, even if the a-pawn is going to fall. Alright, yeah, I think that'll probably be all for today. I know this is a lot of information, so if you stuck around, hopefully you enjoyed the video. And if you enjoyed the video, please drop a like and subscribe if you'd like to. And otherwise, I will be making some more videos likely on endgames. I still have some math videos that I kind of want to upload as well. But yeah, hope you have a nice day and take care. Bye.